Hello everyone, welcome back. Today I will discuss the exam review, the midterm review. I will go over each single question. So you will take the exam the same place. You will find the exam the same place you found the um, exam number one, and you already know the procedure is exactly the same for the quizzes and the exam. So I will just go over the questions today. There will be 50 questions instead of 25, so it's longer than the first exam, and of course you will have more time to finish it. So the first question relates to the first question will start from the Renaissance, and is the chorale. So I will ask you what is the chorale, and you have the question and answer here. So you should read this question and answers, and then go back to the slide if you can to try to contextualize each single definition or term or information in general. So the chorale was the most important genre of Lutheran music, because Lutheran music was different from Catholic music. I talked about this earlier in the semester. And so the chorale was a polyphonic piece of three different voices playing simultaneously, but it was based on a German text, not Latin. So the question is, what is the chorale? The chorale is the most important genre of Lutheran music. We talked about a little bit about the Counter-Reformation, so the influence of the Counter-Reformation on music, and there were two particular directives, two particular decisions that affected music after the Council of Trent, at least at the beginning, which is textual intelligibility, which means textual clarity, so the audibility of the text, and lasciviousness in music, which means no secular elements in in music, in sacred music, so music performed in church. The third question relates to monody. What is monody? Monody, in a certain way, is the opposite of polyphony, and we talked about this when I talked about early opera. So monody is one melody with one instrument. So in other words, there is one person playing and singing. So there is only one melody. The Concerto delle Dame, this Italian term, means it's technically literally means the concert of women. It's the first all-female vocal ensemble. So that dates back to the 16th century. So it's the first all-female vocal ensemble, just made of women at court. And I mentioned that women were not allowed to sing in church at that time, but they were very important at court, so outside of church. So some of them became very famous as well. When and where were the first opera produced? That's the question. It was the early opera began in Florence, and at the end of the 16th century, early 17th century. So at the turn of the 17th century in Florence. And speaking of opera, I also talked about the intermedi. What are these intermedi? The intermedi are intermissions, as the word itself suggests. So the intermedi are intermissions between between the acts of a play. So because opera at the beginning was not sung throughout, so they were musical intermissions between the play. This other term, which is the stile rappresentativo, is a vocal technique, and I explained this, which was halfway between singing and speaking, and that is typical of opera. So that's what the opera is all about. So it's this kind of vocal technique that is halfway between singing and speaking, and any opera you listen to, you would actually hear it. We talked about also that opera emerged as a court phenomenon, but later became a public phenomenon as well, because they were the first public opera theaters and theaters in general in Europe that opened up. So that was very important for music. When was the first and where the first public theater opened? In Venice in 1637. That's the answer. What does cori spezzati mean? Cori spezzati means broken choir. So it means the choirs were singing in church, and sometimes, not always, they were placed in different parts of a building, of the church. So they could be in the opposite side, usually, but there were two choirs basically singing in alternation. So the one choir sang and the other basically responded. I also talked about Frescobaldi, and I asked you, why is this composer important? Because he was one of the most influential composers of 17th century keyboard music, especially the beginning of the 17th century. So he composed a lot of music for the keyboard, so for harpsichord, and later, which will later become the piano. What is an oratorio? We talked about opera, but I also mentioned oratorio. So what is an oratorio? Oratorio is a religious opera. So the main difference between an opera, an oratorio, and an opera is that there is a narrator. So an oratorio has a narrator, while opera does not have a narrator. Okay, so a narrator is someone who actually is telling the story. So he's recounting the story of the oratorio of the opera. Da capo aria. Da capo aria means, what does it mean? It means that it's a type of song which follows an ABA form. So ABA means A, so a section, B, a complete different section, and then A again, which is it's the same or very, very close to the first section, A. The Corellian sonata. How many movements does a Corellian sonata have? 4 movements, usually slow, fast, which is different from, next question, which is different from the Concerto Grosso form, which has 3 movements, and it's usually fast, slow, fast. And you listen to Vivaldi's 4 Seasons, and that's in 3 movements, so that's a Concerto Grosso form. What's a cadenza? Cadenza is a section at the end of, usually at the end of a concerto, that was not written down, so was improvised. So it was the composer basically did not write down the music, but just wrote down the cadenza to let the musician, whoever was performing the piece, that he had to improvise, so to create something on the spot, basically. Ritornello form. If you look at the slides, I made a graph, a detailed graph with the ritornello form. So you should go back and watch that, because it will help you to understand. It's very simple. So you have a ritornello, which means refrain, alternating with solo episodes. So you have a refrain, ritornello, then first solo, then ritornello, then another solo, and so on. Usually the ritornello is not always exactly the same. It can change. Sometimes you hear it as you heard at the beginning, sometimes it changes. So it depends on specific pieces. What's a tragédie lyrique? A tragédie lyrique is a French serious opera, basically, if you want to put it in very simple terms. So it's a French serious opera. So serious means not, obviously means not comic. Next question. Who composed Dido and Aeneas, this English opera? His name was Henry Purcell. That's the name of the composer, Henry Purcell. Okay. And that's in English opera, means it's written in English, not in Italian. So we talked about fugues a little bit. Fugue, in particular, when we talked about Bach, John Sebastian Bach. I want to know the 4 elements of a fugue. There are many elements, but 4 of the main elements of a fugue, which is the subject, the counter subject, the exposition, and the episode. So these are the 4 elements you should remember. There's way more than that, but for the purpose of this class, I think that would be enough. Okay, so subject, counter subject, exposition, and episode. Where did, next question, where did Bach lived until his death, the last 27 years of his life? In Leipzig, this city here, which is in Eastern Germany, right? So some questions are more specific, as you noticed. Some questions are more general, like this one. What does the term classical refer to? So first of all, I mentioned that all these terms like Baroque, classical, Renaissance don't come from music history, but come from art history. So they're borrowed. These are terms that we borrowed from art history. So you kind of need to be cautious when you use this term because um, they're not necessarily applicable to music history. So classical antiquity. So because it's called classical, because there was a revival of an emulation of classical antiquity, so ancient Greece and ancient Rome. During this period, so in the 18th century, uh, who was the main patron of music, of the arts? The aristocracy, right? So not just the church. No longer, we talked about how in the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the church was very powerful. So, was the main patron of the arts. Now in the 18th century, the aristocracy is the main patron of the arts. And we also talk about that until the 17th century, Italy was a very important center for music, but also in the 18th century, Vienna, right? So was one of the major um, musical centers in Europe, Vienna in Austria. What is an opera buffa? Question. An opera buffa is an Italian comic opera. That's the word for Italian comic opera. So you should know this. And then, that next question, you should memorize these two operas here, these two titles, and these two composers. Sorry, here we go. So these two composers here, so these are two comic operas, and I will ask you who composed them. So these two guys here, Paisiello and Pergolesi. And then what was the standard structure of the symphony from the early 18th century? How many movements? 4 movements. And then who was the father of the string quartet, or one of the most important composer of the string quartet? His name was Joseph Haydn, right? So make sure you review that too. Then we talked about the piano a little bit. So the piano, when was the piano invented? It comes from the harpsichord, but it was invented in the early 18th century by this guy. His name was Cristofori. So I will ask you this question too. Here we go. Next question. What's a recitativo obbligato? It's a full orchestral accompaniment. So in other words, there is one singer on the stage, and then the orchestra is playing. So there's full orchestra performing and a person singing. Then I talk about opera buffa, comic opera. So was it based on difficult tunes? No, it was based on very simple tunes, very simple melody, very simple words, because it was supposed to be funny. It was not supposed to be serious. It was supposed to make you laugh, right? So it has to be simple. The music had to be simple, and the words had to be simple. The stories have to be simple. Next question, what was the querelle de Buffon? The querelle de Buffon was a quarrel, so a verbal debate between the supporters of Italian opera and the supporters of French opera in France. And speaking of